I'm Thomas Preece, and this talk essentially is all about open source intelligence. I will prefix this with I'm not an expert in open source intelligence. I only started looking into this about a year ago, so I'm kind of novice in that regard, but this is kind of my experience in what I kind of found, top tips I tended to use. And everyone does a sort of who am I slide. Well, this is an open source intelligence talk, so you're probably going to find out a lot of information about me as we go along, just from the sort of stuff that comes on. So I'm not going to bother filling this slide in. I'll let you fill that in your own time. Disclaimer as usual, anything I present here is nothing to do with my employer for the most part, and I have no affiliation with any tools or the kind of things I'm showing. Use them at your own risk, sort of the usual type stuff. Folks at the back of the room, there's a fair few chairs kicking around. Please do come in, don't sort of hover at the back. It's nicer to sit down for this kind of thing rather than, I guess, kind of hovering and kind of having to stand. There's quite a few at the front as well. So, what is open source intelligence gathering? So generally, it's any information that can be found that is kind of legally obtainable. It's kind of very much passive. So you're looking on the internet, you're looking at social networks, you're looking at blogs, you're looking at anything you can find that just kind of exists there on the public internet or in a public space. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the internet. And obviously this is, I'm applying it to improve my kind of online presence, but it's often used, I guess, as part of reconnaissance during the sort of attack stages. It's very much that information gathering, so you can apply it not just to an individual such as myself, you can apply it to organizations and that kind of thing as well, and that's where it kind of has a lot of value. So the challenge I gave myself was use OSINT, use the kind of whatever techniques you can find out or learn about, use it against me, see with just a name of myself and profile picture, what can I find out? And I guess the challenge there is to assume no prior knowledge about myself, which is quite a difficult one. But that's kind of the challenge and how I approached it. And generally, maybe, well, why do this? So, anyone, as I said, can use OSINT. It could be malicious individuals. It could be essentially anyone that wants to understand about the data that's out there about you, whether it's you that wants to understand that or someone else. It can be part of an attack. This sort of information can be used in a variety of ways. Typically, what you'll tend to think of is those kind of targeted phishing attacks. If you know more details about the user, you can make that phishing attack more believable. If you know what accounts they're using, what passwords they have, then you can start to do account takeover if you're in that malicious mindset. And kind of towards the more extreme endpoints, you have kind of stalking, where, people get your addresses, they'll literally, kind of make your life hell. And swatting, which is possibly the worst thing that can really happen in this area that I know of. Well, there's probably worse things, but it's an awful thing to happen. For those that don't know what swatting is, that's where someone online will take offense at you for some random reason, and they will then essentially find your address and use that to call in like a bomb threat or like a gun threat, and the police will bang on your door. Well, they'll probably knock the door down. A full armed squad will come in and kind of pin you to the ground. That is a really horrendous thing to happen to anyone. And the amount of effort it takes for a malicious individual to do that is quite low using these kind of OSINT techniques. So, understanding what is out there about yourself is really quite useful to try and reduce that down and stop the chance of that kind of thing ever being a possibility. As you're going through this journey of kind of exploring what's out there about yourself, note-taking is probably one of the most fundamental things that you kind of have to be in a good technique doing, because you're going to go down lots of rabbit holes, you're going to go down lots of different avenues, and you want to make sure that when you dive down into one rabbit hole, one avenue, and you go, okay, there's nothing more to explore in this, you don't miss the other 12 different places you could have gone at that point. And so I found Maltego, which is a tool that's often used in this area. I didn't use any of its advanced functions like automatic kind of pinging query data sets and stuff like that. I just used it purely as a graphing database to go along with my written notes, and that produced quite a nice kind of graph at the end to show my kind of complete impact, exposure of all the different data sources and things that I've scattered around the internet. And with most things, you kind of want to just methodically explore every avenue. It's going to be a lot of manual work. It's going to be a lot of manual browsing. There's no automatic tool you can just point that will do all the work. It will help you, But the best thing is literally just get in those web browsers, get in that and look for the information and kind of dive in. You're looking for alternative profiles, you're looking for alternative aliases, looking for email addresses, all that kind of good stuff, because you can then use those sort of details to pivot and find other things. Also, source code, hidden content, metadata that's just in there is always really good as well. So, where do you start if you want to do this? Well, with most things, search engines are probably where you want to start, and that's where I started myself. The important thing to know here is that every search engine will typically have different database on it, so it will produce different results. So search across everything, search engine-wise, you're going to get different results in different places. And so if you only search in Google, you're going to miss some pages that might provide some critical data that reveals a lot more about you or kind of expands that graph. So search everything, see what links pop out, see what applies. I found myself fairly easily on a couple of search engines, others less so. And then just generally anything you do find, start diving into it, have a look. You'll find a personal blog if you look for me. It's quite outdated, but again, there's lots of crap on there, right, that you can then start to explore and look into. As you're starting going down this journey, you'll often find more profile images, you'll find more images, and this is where reverse search in the search engines again can come in useful because people will often reuse profile images across multiple services. So if you found it on one, then you can plonk it in and essentially it might come up with some other links on articles that didn't come up in your original searches. So it's another place you can kind of pivot and find more information. In this case, it popped up with some more articles around kind of something I'd presented in the past for a previous job. So again, another avenue to explore some more details about myself that you would find. As I said, a lot of this is going to be manual, but that doesn't mean you can't get tools in to help you out with some of it. So Photon is a tool that is kind of just a crawler that you can give it a website, and that'll be quite useful along with your manual if you find something like a personal blog or something that is kind of self-contained about that person. That will produce stuff like any intel. So by intel, it means like if it finds an email address or something it thinks is a secret, it'll try and put that in a list for you. Or also importantly, it'll kind of produce a list of all the files it finds, which will become useful later. But it just gives you a load of lists that you can then use and then kind of move forward with that, right? So you've done a bit of perusing, you've found a few pages, you've found a few sites. Where do you go next? You've kind of covered the surface of some of that stuff, and file metadata can be a really interesting avenue to then explore. In particular, image metadata. Now, a lot of services that you put images in, they might strip this metadata. Not everything does. It's very hit and miss. It's not a standard across every service. So if you go onto a site and you find some images, pull them down, store them, have a look, see what metadata's in there. You'll see in here that we've got some GPS coordinates. And so what can you do? You shove those straight into Google and it'll take you to wherever that photo was taken. If the photo is perhaps showing the inside of a building, maybe that's indicating it might be someone's address. And these can be very accurate, right? At this point, I put it in and the address of one of my old front doors popped up of a place I used to live. And, it's like, okay, that's in that image. I need to now scrub that image, right? And so you don't really think about it. You don't think about this metadata a lot of the time when you upload it. You just kind of chuck the images up there. But it can reveal very important and very useful details about yourself. And kind of as an aside, kind of just on the sheer power of metadata to kind of get people thinking, there's an open source tool called PhotoPrism that works a bit like as an offline image viewer. It has some machine learning built into it. I chucked my entire catalog of images into that machine, and it produced a lovely map of everywhere I'd been from the GPS coordinates and all those images. It produced a kind of clustering of people. So here you'll see me in various ages, I guess. It had absolutely no issue linking me from my current state to my old state. It didn't know I was Thomas Preece, but it knows all these images of the same person. And that's kind of scary in some respects because, we upload this image, these things to Facebook, we upload them to social media. And yeah, if they do strip the metadata out, most people can't use that, but that's still a lot of metadata you're giving Facebook. They probably clustered around all those images and gone, right, you live here, you work here, because it can see those images, it can see the GPS coordinates. So that's kind of just a bit of an aside to kind of get you thinking, just like on the larger quantity of images, the larger scale, how much metadata and extra information is there just kind of under the hood. But obviously it's not all about images, so if you find PDFs, documents, executables, anything else, it all has metadata in it. So another tool I found quite useful if you're on Windows is this Fokker tool. And that will essentially, you give it a domain and it will go off and try and pull any files it can find from that domain and then run some metadata analysis on it to see if there's anything in those document files. Obviously, there's other tools you can run for each individual type of file, but again, a quick and easy way of doing some of it. That leads me on to the next stage. So I've been a developer for many years before I moved into security. As part of that, I used a lot of Git. For those that are not familiar with Git, it's essentially a software service, a place you can put source code for your software that kind of tracks commits and sort of stuff like that. In there, again, we have the idea of metadata. So whenever you make a change to the code within Git, it will form what is called a commit. And under that commit, you'll have your email address. This email address might be completely different from the email address you have attached to that online service, like in GitHub. It's just something you manually enter on your machine. That's prone to getting wrong a lot of the time. And what you can find is you can run these automated tools over, just you basically point it at a profile. It'll then go through and pull all of your source code, and it'll look through all the commits and pull all the authors and the email addresses out there. What I found is that as soon as I pulled that, I got alternative email addresses that I don't use anymore. I got an AC UK address from me that is either, I guess, would imply that I either worked at a university or that I've gone to a particular university. I also pulled out essentially BBC email addresses, which would possibly imply I may have worked for the BBC at some point. So again, a lot of leakage, and this is kind of, from an initial point of view of just searching my name, you kind of got to this point. So if you do have Git repos, again, it's worth diving into it because we tend to just shove all sorts of crap in there. You might find secrets, you might find all sorts of stuff in there. So Git's a great place to find this kind of thing. As I said, it's not just about the metadata, the content itself. Maybe there's a file in there that I've put some data in there that might link somewhere else as well. And another thing to be aware of, as we were talking about with the file metadata, it all exists. If you upload an image into Git, you've uploaded that image. Git doesn't filter that, it doesn't change it. So again, all of that, does it have any GPS coordinates? Does it have any metadata? Does it have any metadata that says I took it on a particular phone, a particular brand of phone? Is that going to tell you whether I prefer Apple or Android? Is that going to tell you whether I own that particular device? And you may think, well, it doesn't matter if you know that I own like a Pixel. Well, it might not do. But you could potentially use that in phishing. You could potentially use that in your kind of further confirming that this account is related to me because it wants to verify via a Pixel 6. That's the kind of things you'll start building up those kind of breadcrumbs. Another area that's kind of interesting and kind of slightly scary actually is kind of account recovery and enumeration. And so what you can do on a lot of services is you go forget password, and it will want you to put in some bit of data. So that might be a phone number, it might be your Gmail, email for that account. But what it will do is it will well, I've got this other email address on record that's a recovery email, or I've got this phone number that's another recovery email. In the case of Google, it will kind of star out some of that stuff. But, if you have done some other OSINT and you found, well, this user could possibly be one of these 5 email addresses, you can start to use that account recovery to confirm, yes, these 2 email addresses I've collected are definitely linked. This is definitely the same person because the account recovery is showing me a partial email that matches with the data I've got. Some other places like Facebook, if you put in a phone number, it will give you the full email address of that user. Equally, if you put in an email address, it will give you the full alternative email address of that user. So again, that can be great just to pull information out. The other thing that is kind of interesting is kind of account numeration. So usernames that you pick on a lot of services will be often public, and they also can often not be changed once you've set up that account. And so you can use this and this tool, such as like what's my name, put in essentially a username or an alias in there, and it will run off to a load of different kind of social networks and websites and services. I think there's about just under 600 in there at the moment. And it will say, does that account exist on that service? And so that can give you a really quick way of basically looking over a load of accounts that may be related to this person. Obviously, if you're doing it for yourself, you're going to know whether that account is yours or not. If you're doing this against someone else, then you're going to have to do a lot of extra verification techniques to definitely confirm that the account is owned by the person you're kind of investigating. But it brings to mind, like, why do we use consistent usernames a lot of the time? What benefit does that actually have? particularly considering that with passwords, we're often sticking them in password managers. So we're kind of using those anyway to log in. We might as well stick a random username in there as well. So if you want to kind of reduce the linkage of your data of different accounts, random usernames can be very helpful. This brings us on to social media as the next kind of pivot that I tended to move into. This is quite an interesting one. I don't tend to use that much in the way of social media. If you do find my accounts, they tend to be long, mostly abandoned for the most part. But these can be absolute gold mines of information in a lot of cases. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, you can start pulling breadcrumbs, pieces of information together and kind of build up a bigger picture and reveal more interesting, more sensitive data from that. What I would say is your forgotten accounts too are probably even more valuable. In my case, I have a Facebook account. I don't use it. I use Messenger only for the most part. When I stopped using the main part of Facebook many years ago, I thought I'd left it in a fairly secure, fairly privacy-friendly point. I went on it recently, went back to it, my friends list was public, there was a load of posts that were public, there was a load of stuff, and I think that's kind of the privacy settings change, so if you have an account you're not going to use for a long while, delete it, it's probably the best course. But equally, in the case of like Facebook and that sort of thing, if your friends list is public, then someone can go on there, they can find you on Facebook, they can look at your friends list, and then they can start to find your family and friends. And as I'm sure is the case with a lot of you, your family and friends are possibly not as privacy conscious as you might be. So, if you can find that person's family and friends, can you also find a load of information they've shared about you on there? And that's often, I managed to do that. I found very easily from a public profile, I found myself on Facebook. I then found my essentially relatives and siblings. And from there, I could gain a load more information because that linkage existed in Facebook and I had allowed it to be public. So again, check your settings and think about that. Educate where you can, but obviously, it's often an uphill sell. So reduce as much damage there as you can, really. As I keep saying, piecing together the breadcrumbs is quite an interesting thing in OSINT because a lot of the time you may consider one particular piece of information you share as being quite unimportant, not that sensitive, not really that interesting. But if you share enough individual bits, you may start to be able to bring it together. And this is quite interesting from kind of an image point of view. And like here we have a picture of a front door. And on Facebook, maybe they've said we're in the area Edale. Well, if I go on Google Maps and look at Edale, there's a few roads on there. How long is it going to take me to go in Google Street View, go along those roads and find a fairly unique looking door like that? Granted, there's a number on there as well, so it makes it even easier. But, if you're just sharing a photo outside your house, that could still be used to track down your exact address because that data kind of lives in Google Maps. And so, something that's fairly innocuous, I live in this town. Something that's also sort of fairly innocuous, this is, a picture of me in front of my house. Tied together, produces something very sensitive like my exact address, right? And that's kind of the approach you need to take with all of this stuff is why mapping everything is very useful because you will come across a load of information that together will be a lot more sensitive than on its own. Okay, the next thing that I tended to dive into was domains. So as you've seen from some of the previous slides, I own a top level, not top level, I own my domain that basically I dump random crap onto a lot of the time. As part of that registration for that domain, you have to enter a name, address, email, and phone number if you've not done it before. Typically, that data is publicly viewable. There has always been this ability to have a privacy service where if you opt in, your details will be replaced by kind of redacted for privacy or that kind of thing, right? Typically nowadays, you'll find that those kind of services are usually on by default and free. They never used to be. I think GDPR kind of changed that or pushed it towards the kind of better. But, at the moment, if you look at my domain, you'll get all that kind of information. However, there's historical data. There's databases that keep hold of all of this old data. You'll often find a lot of sites you may have to pay for to access this data. I found one called Woxy that seems to work completely for free at this point, so that's possibly one to use if you're thinking of putting stuff in there. But again, you can put a domain name in there. It'll bring back details such as the name, the address of that person when they registered it, the phone number, email address, and you again can use that information. It's like, okay, well that email address registered that domain, let's put that email address back in the database. What else also registered via that email address? And you can then start to bring up more domains. And obviously, this data only really applies for stuff prior 2017, 16, something like that. Most of the stuff nowadays tends to be protected, but there's still a huge chunk of historical data for those of you that have those domains that kind of exist or existed before then. But it's not just kind of those sort of things that you can do in domains. Domains have a load of records under them, so name servers, which is kind of often used to point to your hosting provider. In this case, you can understand which hosting provider I'm on. You may think, well, big whoop again, right? It's a bit of information, but if you find that hosting provider, that might be able to phish them directly and say, okay, this hosting provider, you need to log in, you now can provide them a portal, you can steal the password, get on and completely trash that website. So that's, again, a useful piece of information, even though it's kind of just sat there in the open. TXT records are also really useful on domains because these are often used for verifying that you own that domain in a different service. So if we look at Google here, you'll see that the TXT records imply that they're using Atlassian products, so they might be using Jira, they might be using Confluence, maybe Bitbucket. They also seem to be using some form of DocuSign, Facebook, so they're obviously on some kind of Facebook console, that kind of thing. So you can get a whole heap of information from a lot of domains just by asking what's the TXT records. You might be able to understand what services they use on the hood. Microsoft obviously is in there, so maybe they're using Microsoft 365. If you do it onto my domain, you'll get Google and you'll also get Proton Mail. So maybe this person uses Proton Mail, maybe they don't. But they have a verification record there. So again, another piece of information that just exists. Certificate transparency logs, for anyone that's not familiar with that. Whenever you register a HTTPS certificate, nowadays it has to go into a log that is publicly searchable. Great for enumerating subdomains. You can go on there and basically give me everything under thomaspreece.com and it'd be like, here's all the certificates you've registered in the past, how many, year or something. And obviously if you've minted them for subdomains, that might provide you even more attack surface, more places to look under the main domain that may not be findable via their search engines. So again, it's a great place. And if you kind of want to automate this sort of thing, then Mass is a great tool. It searches not just certificate transparency logs, but it searches sort of Wayback Machine, like historical archives and a load of different APIs. So it can really kind of give you a huge list of domains that you can then potentially look at further. And that's kind of the domains covered. There's a lot more you could dive into there, but the next thing I kind of wanted to look into that didn't necessarily directly apply to me, but it's useful for anyone that lives in the UK, is kind of the UK-based data sources. So Companies House is one that is essentially fully public. So if you've ever registered a company, your details will be on there with the name of the company. You'll be able to search for that person and the company. It includes date of birth, which again is quite sensitive, and it'll also usually have the correspondence address, which may be a company address. But if it's a small company, then it's probably just going to be the home address of that person. This is publicly searchable. It exists. There's no way to wipe this for the most part. Similarly, Open Electoral Register, if you've not opted out of it, that'll appear in kind of directories like 192. You will need to kind of correlate that with where you think they might be located to really get dived down, but you'll be able to dive into it and it'll give you the full address of that person. So again, more information that kind of exists. And another one that's kind of novel or interesting is if you own a house and you put in a planning application for whatever, then what you'll need to do is you'll need to fill in a form like this, and that will have your name on it. It'll have the agent's name along with the addresses and phone numbers and that kind of details. Well, this information is public, right? If you want to look up a planning application, you can quite happily get that. And each UK planning portal, separated by councils, tends to be fairly similar. You can usually go on there. If you know, say, the person lives in the London area, you'd be like, okay, go on there, go on the relevant planning permission portal, you'd search the name for the person. Here's all the list of applications. You go on there and be like, okay, this person lives at this address because they put in that application. They're really bad at redacting this information, so there's quite a novel little source of information if you definitely know the person owns a house and has done something like extensions or that kind of thing. So this leads us on to kind of archive data, and this is another kind of gold mine. So Wayback Machine, for those who aren't familiar, are kind of this non-profit that have been archiving the internet since 1996. But it's a great thing to go on. You put in any site and you can basically it will say, well, I have captures for this in 2012, 2015, etc., and you can scrub backwards and forwards and look through those sites. Why am I saying that? Well, if you put a site on the internet many years ago and perhaps you didn't do the perhaps it was crap, or there was a load of extra details on there that you realize, crap, I need to remove those at some point. Well, if you're unlucky and Wayback Machine has captured that, that is still publicly available via this interface. So that's kind of really useful to know about as a thing, because you can always scrub back to older versions of sites, maybe find other details, extra details, stuff that's been removed since that's no longer on the live internet. Next step, password breaches. So I guess by the time you got to this point, you've probably got a huge array of different email addresses the person's used. You've probably got a huge array of addresses. Maybe you've got some phone numbers. You've got a load of different information about some of the services they might be using. But you can also get some more information about what other services they're using. So have I been pwned, which hopefully a load of people will know. You can stick your email address in there and it will say, okay, you've been in all these different data breaches. So this is great as a quick, okay, what stuff has been breached with all these email addresses you found about yourself. But you can go one step further and you can actually pivot on the content of those data breaches. So there's a few sites out there that will host essentially the databases in full. They won't redact the data. So I use that to essentially look up my email address, and on that it would then give me full passwords in some cases. Sometimes it would give me hash passwords. It would give me names. It would give me IP addresses. And kind of with IP addresses, emails, and that password, you can then pivot on that and be like, okay, give me all the other stuff that is from the same IP address at that point. And you can then, again, see more data breaches. It might bring you to different email addresses. It might bring you to different data. And if you're really lucky, you might have something like this Deezer data breach that for some reason has date of birth. It's a music streaming service. Why does it want your date of birth? I don't know. Luckily, I was sensible enough when I set this up that I gave it a complete fake date of birth, because I was like, why does the music service need it? But you may not be as unlucky, right? So you might find this just as public data that exists. And kind of moving on from that, like a malicious entity is not going to stop as just public passive information. They're going to log into your accounts. They're going to see what extra, if they log into your Amazon account, maybe they can dump your credit card details, that sort of thing, right? So I think the ultimate thing there is try and map out exactly what sites and services you have used. For 30 years of using the internet, I've scattered accounts across the four corners of the internet. I've created loads of accounts everywhere. I only recently became more security aware, and only recently started using more password managers. So I have a password manager with a load of stuff in it, but it's not going to cover a lot of the stuff I maybe created 20 years ago. So it's about thinking what other stuff is out there, trying to find that. And if you do have a password manager, have a look at the exposed passwords report in there. That is very useful, at least for you to clear up those high-value items. If you look over that list and see Amazon has a breached password in there, change it, right? If you see that a forum that you have no details to, that you used maybe once, maybe that's less important on that list. But equally, don't use weak passwords. And, if you've used the same password for 20 years, because, that's what a lot of people did in the early days, then maybe that you need to fix that, right? So those are most of the areas that I found. That revealed quite a lot of information about myself. It sort of surprisingly so, it came up with a lot of information. I'm not sharing most of it here for public reasons. I've tried to clean a bit of it up, but we'll see why that's kind of problematic. If you want to kind of do it yourself, then I would highly recommend this YouTube video. The 5 Hour by the Cybermental, that's kind of what I started watching, and it gave an excellent rundown and a start into OSINT. But there's other stuff on YouTube, there's other blogs and articles that are well worth looking into. Obviously, the stuff that I'm on is probably going to be different from the stuff other people are on, so it might be, it might be that you want to dive more into Instagram, for instance, whereas I have absolutely no interest in that, so it won't make sense for me to investigate that. Overall, my tips is basically it's time, really. The main barrier I tend to find is that just putting in the time to manually scrub over these sites and kind of look over the details. As I said earlier, notes are vital. If you don't have good notes, if you come back to your kind of investigation half a year later and you don't remember what you investigated, you're going to have to start again. And so making sure those notes are there, making sure you've got that graph of all your data is very useful as well to kind of try and help clean up stuff later. And as I said, expect many, many rabbit holes. You're going to go down certain avenues that just don't tend anywhere, as you would expect. And I've tended to find that very few things required me to pay some money. For the most part, I managed to find something free. So, it is public data in in the ultimately, so for the most part you should be able to find it, and hopefully a free service, but there's maybe one or two you might have to pay for. So this brings us on to, okay, you found out that you've got tons of data everywhere and it's a massive problem. What do you do? Well, this is where it gets tricky, right? Because yes, you can delete those accounts, you can delete those old posts, and that's definitely a good first step. You can share less, but that won't help your historical data. But as we said before, that kind of web archive stuff, if it's in the web archive, if it's been archived by a third party, not necessarily Wayback Machine, just if that data has been archived somewhere, it can be incredibly difficult to get rid of it. And so really what you want to try and do is work towards removing links to that content. If you can't go from one of your aliases to a different one of your aliases because the links no longer exist, they're not going to think to look that up in the Wayback Machine. So, you know, it's kind of the best you can do is not remove the content, but just make it harder to find. And I guess I promised you 30 years of data leakage, and I've probably not shown you 30 years of data leakage. Well, that's because I'm quite lucky in that when I grew up, stuff like Wayback Machine wasn't archiving as much. The stuff I contributed to, the forums I was part of, no longer exists. They're long since in the dust, and I can't find the kind of any of that data still present from what I can see. I also deployed on free web services, which had very little search engine optimization and were deemed very much not important. So most of them aren't archived, which I'm very happy about. Most of my data seems to kind of start from the 2012 period onwards, which, you know, is not great, but still it's less than 30 years. And so in most cases, if I was talking about preserving our culture through preserving the internet, I'd probably be saying, oh my God, link rot, that's a massive problem. Link rot being kind of just the natural tendency for the internet to kind of disappear over time, for pages to disappear, for links to disappear. However, in our case, link rot is very useful because we don't want that information on the internet. And so, you know, stuff starts to disappear, and hopefully you would hope, you know, over time, stuff will start to kind of disappear and you stand a better chance of the information that you want to kind of be removed. As we get further on with web archiving, you know, there's more effort into this nowadays, so it becomes a lot harder. A lot more stuff is copied, captured, copied. But it's interesting to understand that stuff like the Wayback Machine, it kind of archives, you know, a very shallow depth. So if you've got stuff that's like in a forum post within a forum, it's probably not going to be deemed important enough to capture, so you stand a good chance. Whereas if you have your own site that you've done search engine optimization on, that may be considered more important, so it may actually be in those web archives. But it's interesting to kind of look at it from that point of view of like, you may be lucky that your stuff when you were younger wasn't classed important enough to be captured and archived. But with all that said, I guess the take-home message here is, you know, apply these techniques to yourself, see what you can find. It may shock you. You may find accounts that have been dormant for 20 years that surprisingly are still there and still exist. You might find a blog that still exists that you haven't posted to for years but has something sensitive in it. And, you know, you can use that knowledge, use that graph and go, well, there's a link between here and here. How can I sever that link? How can I stop that from being a problem? And generally just using that knowledge to essentially sever those links will help you, you know, kind of help you to not be as easily, have that information found as easily. And ultimately, you know, as you've seen, web archiving stuff is becoming more and more common. A lot more effort's put into it. A lot more stuff is duplicated nowadays because, let's face it, hard drives and storage is fairly cheap compared to what it used to be. So I think, you know, we just have to be more aware of what we share nowadays than we used to be. So I think going forward is probably your easiest thing of like, okay, I'm just going to draw a line here. I'm going to be better at this going forward. But obviously that's a bit of a crap point, right? But hopefully this will at least, you know, allow you to investigate, have a look at what's out there about you. And it might shock you enough to actually put the effort into maybe being more aware of what you share in the future. With that is all I've got for you today. I guess if we've got any questions, I guess we'll have to wait for the mic. Got a mic?
Hello. You can remove stuff from the Wayback Machine with robots.txt. If you add a robots.txt, then Wayback Machine won't include your stuff.
Yeah, so I guess in the context of a website, you can, I guess, discourage people from archiving that site. You can discourage people from browsing that site. But you don't have to follow that, right? It's not mandatory for that site. You know, it's still publicly available. That doesn't help in the case of stuff like data sources around domain registration or other data sources like companies' data and other stuff like that. But yeah, you know, that is definitely a good technique. However, you've got to balance that on kind of if you disable crawling for your site, then you're likely going to have an issue with search engine optimization because they're not going to have any content. So you're trying to balance that of how much do you want to get found. Maybe you want to be found, you just don't want that all your data to be found. So it can be a tricky one. I've not personally disabled that on some of my sites because I generally want me to be found in some ways, but not all of that data, if that makes sense. Cool. I think I got a question over here.
Sorry, I'll go here. She's close.
Hi, can you hear me? Oh, okay, that's
it's cool. Just about. You have to speak up a bit.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask. I just wanted to ask that. For example, when it comes to deleted accounts and things like that, do those still pop up? Like, is that how the Wayback Machine would work?
Yeah, so the Wayback Machine, the way it works is you input a URL, a full URL. So you can't search it and go, give me any pages that reference Thomas Preece. It doesn't work like you have to give it a full URL. So if you delete that account in the first place, it's got to rely on the person knowing that that specific URL, that specific account has been archived at some point. They then put that into Wayback Machine, and if Wayback Machine has archived it, they will find it. You've not removed that content from the Wayback Machine, you've not removed it from existing, but you've made it significantly harder to find, and I think that's the strategy I would say is probably the best here, more realistic. If delete it, we'll remove a lot of links to it, it will make it harder to find. So yeah, it's still there, but it's harder to find. Sure.
Hey, buddy. I really appreciate the talk. Thanks for sharing today. I noticed you're a very technical kind of guy with mathematics degrees and whatnot. What triggered you to find an interest in OSINTs?
I think it was an area I'd not really looked into, and it's one of those that I think has a really low barrier of entry, right? For the majority of the stuff I've shown is get a web browser out and look on the search engines. So it was just something that is like, hey, this is interesting, I have 10 minutes spare here, I have 10 minutes spare tomorrow, and just kind of carried it on, having a look, having a bit of a research, seeing what was available. And I think that's kind of what triggered it. And then as I got more into it, I was like, well, crap, I didn't realize you could find that. Oh my God, this exists somewhere. It sort of spiraled and I put more energy into it. But I think it's just because it's a low barrier entry and it's generally, I find it very interesting.
We'll go second line first and then come to you after.
Hello. So there seems to be a growing number of companies who offer a service where they'll get rid of your data online for some monthly fee. I think these tend to be more targeted at companies that you've given your permission to hold data about you, and so they're going to go around and try and find all those companies and then get their deletion requests and things. Is this something you've looked into at all? I've never looked into it that much. I'm wondering if they're effective at all or something worth paying for.
Yeah, it's not something I've looked into. I think a lot of the way they do it is kind of just spam takedown requests at a load of companies, and a lot of companies go, do you know what, we can't be bothered to fight the legal ramifications costs in this, so we'll just remove it. Sometimes that data might exist and you might issue a takedown request and it might embolden the company to actually go, do you know what, stop being an idiot, this data's public, we're going to keep it there, and if you try a takedown request at the wrong site, wrong service, it might mean that you actually put more, you end up with more focus, more attention on that because you've kind of kicked up a fuss rather than just kind of letting it quietly die in a corner of the internet.
You're probably giving your data to another company as well to then collate it in one place, which might be not a great idea.
Yeah, for sure. I guess you've got to trust that company to not also store it in a database and then sell it onwards, that kind of thing.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I was wondering if you thought that there is value in scrambling some of the data rather than removing it completely, just because there's so many companies that are trying to index stuff on you, and if they find things and it's missing, then they'll just keep what they have. If they find something and it has new data there, maybe they'll overwrite in the database, and that will have a better net effect.
That's really interesting. I've not really thought about that. I guess my worry would be how you're scrambling it. Like, for instance, a lot of, as I was saying before, a lot of usernames tend to be static, constant, and unable to be changed. So if your data still exists, but it's scrambled under that username, I can still find that username fairly easily, and maybe then I stick it in like an archive that brings back the old version. So, yeah, it's very interesting. I've not really considered that, but I think there might, in certain circumstances, it might still make it findable.
Hello. Have you looked into face reverse image searching, where a website will use AI to identify features in a face and then follow that back through its database of images?
Yeah, so I did try. I don't think it was quite AI. I think it was more just slightly more advanced. Not advanced, what's the word? It had kind of captured more images and been more focused on that kind of search type thing around faces only. I didn't pop up as important enough, I guess, to find my face in there. I think with the reverse search, from what I've seen, is still pretty good. What you may have to do if you're looking particularly like, say, an image of me, and it's like a picture, like maybe I've taken on holiday, you might have to do some processing to remove the background, because the search engine might get confused and say, oh, you want to see pictures of beaches, not pictures of me. So I think there's definitely some processing that may be required to get the best out of the reverse search, but I've not played specifically with kind of AI-based ones.
Thank you. So things like the government information, Companies House, you are legally required, if you're a director of a company, to have your information available. Is there any kind of legal legislation that we could force the government to change this sort of situation?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, right? Because I think there's definitely public interest there of knowing where the company is, right? If you're dealing with that particular company, and they can hide behind complete privacy if, like, we don't have an address, it doesn't exist, that, you know, it's kind of that balance between privacy and, like, sort of other things coming in. I don't know of anything particular that can force them. I know in the UK we generally have better, so if you compare, like, the data sources we'll typically use in the UK around this stuff versus the data sources that might be in the US or whatnot, you'll tend to find that finding information about an individual is a lot easier in the US, because they're a bit more, like, those data services exist a bit more, that data is more available. So I think we're still in an okay position in the UK with, like, general finding people. But yeah, I must admit, in that kind of the planning portal stuff was a bit of a shock. And the Companies House stuff is obviously a fairly big problem. If you want to not tie it to yourself, it probably is best if you have, like, a company premises. At least that's, like, one step away from your personal address. But yeah, I don't know of any. I'm not really a legislation person, so I don't know on that one. All right, awesome. Well, I'm around, so if anyone has any more questions, feel free to come ask me. Yeah. But cheers all for your time.